On June 6, 1944, the Allies faced a nightmare: impossible tides, deadly German defenses, and a coastline designed to destroy invaders. But the US had a secret, a massive engineering creation so advanced, soldiers thought it was science fiction. This is the miracle that turned D-Day from near failure into victory. June 6, 1944. 6:30 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The English Channel is a churning cauldron of slate-gray water and diesel fumes. On the horizon, the silhouettes of 5,000 ships flicker against a bruised sky, but closer to shore, the reality is a nightmare of physics. Under the shadow of the Colleville Bluffs, the first waves of American infantry are being shredded by MG-42 fire. To the German defenders in Widerstandsnest 62, the math is simple: even if the Americans take the sand, they cannot stay. There are no cranes here. There are no deep-water piers. There is only a narrow ribbon of silt and blood. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has staked the Third Reich on a single, logical certainty: an army of 1 million men cannot be fed, armed, or fueled from a beach. To win, the Allies need a port. To get a port, they must capture a city like Cherbourg or Le Havre, cities the Wehrmacht has turned into fortresses. But as the tide retreats, revealing a graveyard of burnt-out landing craft, a different kind of fleet is appearing on the horizon. They are massive, slab-sided concrete monsters, towed by tugboats at a grueling 4 knots. They look less like ships and more like floating city blocks. The Germans watch through binoculars, confused. They are looking at the end of the Atlantic Wall, not a secret weapon of destruction, but a miracle of construction. The impossible was about to be anchored to the seabed. The genesis of this engineering defiance was born from a massacre. 2 years prior, in August 1942, the Allies had tested the German theory that a port could be taken from the sea. Operation Jubilee, the raid on the French port of Dieppe, resulted in a catastrophe that haunted the Allied High Command. Within hours, over 3,000 soldiers, mostly Canadians, were killed, wounded, or captured. The lesson was brutal and crystalline: the Germans had spent years reinforcing every natural harbor in Europe. Attacking a ready-made port was a fool's errand, a recipe for the annihilation of an invasion force before it could even move inland. Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall was a masterpiece of defensive geography. Stretching from the North Cape of Norway to the Spanish border, it relied on the belief that the Allies were tethered to the logistics of the 19th century. To land an army of the scale required to crush the Third Reich, one needed deep-water berths to accommodate the massive transport ships carrying tanks, heavy artillery, and millions of tons of ammunition. Without these piers, the Allies would be restricted to small landing craft, easily picked off by shore batteries or pinned down on the sand until they ran out of bullets. The German Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, rested easy knowing that the Normandy coast, with its vast tidal ranges and shallow, sandy shelves, was an impossible site for a major logistical hub. The tides at Normandy are among the most violent in the world, rising and falling by as much as 25 feet in a single cycle. Any pier built by traditional means would be crushed by the surf or left high and dry by the receding ocean. The Germans didn't just have the Wehrmacht on their side, they had the laws of hydrodynamics. By late 1943, the Allied planners under General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a terrifying paradox. They had the men, and they had the will, but they lacked the portal. If they landed on the beaches without a port, they would starve. If they attacked a fortified port, they would be slaughtered. The invasion of Europe seemed mathematically impossible, unless they could find a way to ignore the coastline as it existed and reinvent the very concept of a harbor. As the winter of 1943 approached, the pressure mounted. The Soviet Union was screaming for a second front, and the sheer volume of American industrial output was clogging every port in Great Britain. Millions of tons of steel, thousands of Sherman tanks, and mountains of creations were stacking up in the English countryside. The Great Crusade was a massive engine with nowhere to plug in. It was here, in the smoke-filled rooms of the Admiralty and the War Office, that the most audacious engineering plan in the history of warfare began to take shape. They would not capture a port, they would build one in England, sail it across the most dangerous channel in the world, and drop it onto the enemy's doorstep. The solution to the port paradox didn't come from a battlefield general, but from the restless, idiosyncratic mind of Winston Churchill. As early as 1942, Churchill had sent a pithy, now famous memo to Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. It read, "Piers for use on flat beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The problem of anchoring has been mastered. We will let the difficulties argue for themselves." It was a classic Churchillian demand, ignoring the how to focus entirely on the must. This directive fell to the whiz kids of the British War Office and the Royal Engineers. The project was given the enigmatic codename Mulberry. The scale of what they proposed was staggering. They weren't just building a dock, they were designing two complete, prefabricated harbors, each the size of the port of Dover. One, Mulberry A, was destined for the American sector at Omaha Beach. The other, Mulberry B, nicknamed Port Winston, would be placed at the British sector of Arromanches. The engineering hurdles were immense. To create a calm anchorage in the middle of the turbulent English Channel, they needed a breakwater. But how do you build a seawall 3 miles long in a matter of days while under enemy fire? The answer was a three-tiered system of protection. First, they would sink old merchant ships, known as gooseberries, to create an immediate line of shelter. Second, they would sink massive, hollow concrete blocks called phoenix caissons. Each phoenix was as large as a 5-story building, weighing up to 6,000 tons. The third and most brilliant component was the whale, a system of floating roadways. These were flexible steel tracks supported by beetle pontoons, designed to rise and fall with that massive 25-foot tide. This meant that 24 hours a day, regardless of the water level, heavy trucks could drive straight from the bowels of a transport ship and roll onto the dry land of France. While the British led the design, the Americans brought the industrial muscle. Over 19,000 workers in construction yards across the UK worked in total secrecy. They cast hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete into shapes that looked like modern art, but were actually precisely engineered naval vessels. By the spring of 1944, the components were hidden in backwater estuaries along the English coast, submerged beneath the water to hide them from Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes. The Germans saw the empty beaches of Normandy and saw a dead end. The Allies looked at the same beaches and saw a blank canvas for the greatest engineering feat in military history. The success of the Mulberry harbors was not a singular victory of design, it was a victory of tactical geography. The Allied planners, specifically those within the Cossack, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, group, had to find a location that was simultaneously a weakness in the German Atlantic Wall and a strength for artificial construction. They chose the Gold and Omaha sectors specifically because of the rock-strewn but relatively flat sea floor. Arromanches, in particular, was shielded by the Calvados rocks, a natural underwater reef that acted as a first-line defense against the brutal currents of the channel. Without this specific geological profile, the concrete phoenix caissons would have been scoured by the tides and toppled within days. It was a high-stakes gamble. They were choosing their battlefield based on the sea floor, rather than the land above. This leads directly into the technological angle, the physics of the phoenix caissons. These were not merely concrete boxes, they were masterpieces of naval architecture. Each caisson was designed with a series of internal valves and ballast chambers. To move them, they had to be buoyant enough to be towed by a single tugboat. Once in position, engineers would open the Sikaku valves, allowing water to rush into the chambers in a controlled sequence. If the water entered too quickly or unevenly, the massive structure would capsize, becoming a navigational hazard rather than a breakwater. The precision required was staggering. Each phoenix had to be parked within inches of its neighbor to create a seamless wall against the Atlantic. It was a feat of industrial origami, folding a permanent, deep-water port into a series of transportable components that could withstand the kinetic energy of millions of tons of seawater. From the human perspective, the Mulberry project was a grueling test of maritime skill. The whale, crews and the tugboat pilots were the unsung heroes of this logistical armada. To bring the harbors to life, over 150 tugboats, many of them small, wooden-hulled vessels from the civilian pools of the US and UK, had to haul the massive concrete caissons across 100 miles of open, mine-strewn water. The pilots were operating at the absolute limit of their vessel's towing capacity. If a phoenix caisson began to take on water or yaw in the heavy swells, it could easily drag a tugboat under. These crews worked in a state of perpetual exhaustion, navigating by dead reckoning in the dark to avoid German E-boat patrols, knowing that a single collision would not just sink their ship, but could potentially block the entire invasion supply line. Finally, we must consider the enemy angle. German intelligence, led by the Abwehr and the SD, suffered a catastrophic failure of imagination. They were so focused on the port trap, the idea that the Allies must seize a major city, that they completely discounted the possibility of a mobile harbor. To the German High Command, a harbor was a static, geographical entity. They saw the Allied buildup in England but interpreted the concrete phoenix caissons as merely bizarre barges or perhaps defensive structures for the UK coast. Even when the first gooseberry ships were scuttled on June 7, German observers initially reported that the Allies were losing ships to shore fire and that the wrecks were clogging the beaches. They didn't realize they were watching the foundations of a city being laid. This blind spot allowed the Mulberries to be established with surprisingly little interference from the Luftwaffe or the Kriegsmarine in those critical first 72 hours. The Germans were waiting for a battle at the gates of a city, while the Americans were simply bringing the city to the beach. June 7, 1944. 7 o'clock hours. The English Channel. The Great Crossing began while the smoke of the initial landings still hung over the Normandy coast. It was a procession unlike anything in the history of naval warfare. Across 100 miles of choppy water, a bizarre flotilla of over 400 components began to move. To an observer from the air, it looked as though the industrial heart of England had detached itself and was drifting toward France. The tugboats, many of them American V4M A1 types, strained against their hawsers. Behind them, the massive Phoenix caissons wallowed in the swells, their sheer concrete walls catching the wind like sails. These 6,000-ton monsters were being towed at a glacial pace of 4 knots. At this speed, they were sitting ducks for German U-boats or E-boat torpedoes. Every hour the sun stayed up was an hour of extreme vulnerability. On the bridges of the tugs, captains stared at their watches and their depth sounders. The timing had to be perfect. If they arrived at the French coast at the wrong stage of the tide, the caissons would be impossible to scuttle in the correct positions. As they neared Omaha and Gold Beaches, the Gooseberry ships, veteran merchant vessels and old warships, were already being steamed into position and scuttled. Explosive charges blew out their hulls, and they settled into the sand, their superstructures remaining above the waves to create an immediate breakwater. By June 8, the whales, the floating roadways, began to arrive. Engineers from the 108th Construction Battalion, Seabees, and the Royal Engineers went to work in the surf. They were working under sporadic shellfire from German batteries hidden inland that had not yet been silenced. Men jumped into the freezing water to bolt steel spans together, while beetle pontoons were anchored to the sea floor. The Americans at Mulberry A, St. Laurent, were working with a frantic energy. They knew that the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions inland were already running low on ammunition. The sheer scale of the operation began to manifest as the first Phoenix was positioned. The seacocks were opened. With a haunting, metallic groan and a massive venting of air, the concrete giant sank into the seabed. One by one, the blocks fell into line, creating a 3-mile-long wall of stone and steel in the middle of the ocean. By June 16, Mulberry A was operational. A 10,000-ton Liberty ship could now pull up to a pier in the middle of the English Channel and offload its cargo directly onto a roadway that led to the heart of France. The impossible had been achieved, but nature was about to demand a terrible price. June 19, 1944. 2 o'clock hours. The Normandy coast. The triumph of the Mulberry harbors was met by the most violent weather event to hit the English Channel in 40 years. A great storm descended from the northeast with a ferocity that no engineer could have predicted. For 3 days, the English Channel was transformed into a chaotic graveyard of twisted steel and shattered concrete. Winds reached 60 miles per hour, and waves, now 15 feet high, crested over the tops of the Phoenix breakwaters. The American harbor, Mulberry A at St. Laurent, bore the brunt of the storm's fury. Because it had been constructed on a steeper gradient of the seabed and lacked the natural protection of the Calvados Reef found at the British site, the surge was catastrophic. The massive concrete caissons, designed to withstand the steady pressure of the tide, were literally lifted off the sea floor by the swells and slammed back down, shattering their foundations. The whale roadways, flexible but not indestructible, were twisted into pretzels of jagged metal. Hundreds of landing craft, seeking shelter within the harbor, were instead smashed against the very piers designed to protect them. By June 22, the American Mulberry was a total loss. Over 20 ships were sunk, and nearly 800 craft were stranded or destroyed. In the war rooms of London and Washington, a cold panic set in. Without the harbor, the American supply line was severed. The impossible marvel had been broken by the sea. However, this disaster revealed a secondary turning point in the story. While the American harbor was scrapped, the British Port Winston at Arromanches survived, albeit heavily damaged. More importantly, the American beachmasters realized that the Gooseberry block ships, the sunken merchant vessels, had held their ground. Under the most desperate pressure of the war, the Americans pioneered a rough landing system. They used the wreckage of the Mulberry as a partial breakwater and began drying out LSTs, landing ship tanks, by intentional grounding them on the beach at high tide and unloading them directly onto the sand as the water receded. The loss of Mulberry A should have ended the invasion. Instead, the tenacity of the engineers and the sheer volume of equipment already moved meant that the supply miracle continued. The British Mulberry Bee became the busiest port in the world, handling 11,000 tons of supplies a day, while the Americans proved they could move mountains even through the ruins of their own engineering masterpiece. The Germans, watching the storm from the heights, expected the Allies to be washed back into the sea. Instead, they watched as the flow of tanks and men actually accelerated. The wreckage of Mulberry A at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer was a sobering sight, but it did not signify the end of the American logistical effort. In fact, it forced an evolution. While the whale roadways lay twisted on the sand, the American engineers proved their legendary adaptability. They salvaged what they could, primarily the flexible steel spans, and shipped them 10 miles east to reinforce the British Mulberry Bee at Arromanches. The statistics that emerged from Port Winston in the following months are staggering. By the end of June, the British harbour was handling more cargo than the Port of London. In its first 100 days of operation, the Mulberry system facilitated the landing of over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. This was not a trickle, it was a flood. Every day, the equivalent of a small city's worth of food, fuel, and ammunition was being pumped into the French countryside. The German high command was paralyzed by these numbers. Their strategy, the port trap, had failed. They had concentrated their best divisions around the major ports like Cherbourg and Le Havre, expecting the Allies to be desperate to capture them. Because of the Mulberry, the Allies didn't have to be desperate. They could afford to conduct a methodical, bloody siege of Cherbourg while their main force was already deep in the Bocage country, fueled by the artificial harbor. When the Americans finally captured Cherbourg on June 27, 1944, they found the port utterly demolished, docks blown up, basins filled with scuttled ships, and the water carpeted with magnetic mines. Under normal circumstances, this would have stalled the Allied advance for months. But with Mulberry Bee still humming at peak capacity, the destruction of Cherbourg was a tactical inconvenience rather than a strategic disaster. The Americans had effectively decoupled the invasion from the geography of France. By bringing their own port, they had rendered the Germans' most expensive coastal fortifications irrelevant. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just breached, it was bypassed. The logistical shadow cast by the Mulberries extended far beyond the beaches of Normandy. As the Allies broke out of the hedgerows during Operation Cobra in late July, the "miracle of the piers" allowed the Third Army under General George S. Patton to race across France with a reckless speed that stunned the Wehrmacht. This was only possible because the Mulberry at Arromanches, combined with the gooseberry breakwaters at the other beaches, created a stable environment for the new Red Ball Express trucking convoys to begin their journey inland. Verifiable reports from the SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, highlight the sheer psychological blow this dealt to the German leadership. Captured documents from the 7th Army revealed a sense of disbelief among German officers. One report noted, "The enemy is not landing at a port, he is creating a port wherever he stands. Our calculations of his supply capabilities were off by a factor of 10. The Germans had built their defense on the assumption of Allied scarcity. The Mulberries provided the reality of Allied abundance. By the time the autumn storms of 1944 arrived, the Mulberries had served their primary purpose. Though they were eventually phased out as the deep-water ports of Antwerp and Cherbourg were cleared of mines and repaired, the artificial harbors had bought the Allies the most precious commodity in war, time. They provided the bridgehead that allowed the Allied industrial machine to plant its feet firmly on European soil. Without that footing, the liberation of Paris and the eventual push into the Rhineland would have been delayed by a year, or perhaps failed entirely. The cost was high, millions of pounds and thousands of man-hours spent on structures that were destined to be discarded or reclaimed by the sea. But in the cold calculus of 1944, the price was a bargain. The suicide mission of invading a continent without a port had been transformed into a masterclass of industrial warfare. The Mulberry harbors proved that the Americans and British did not just outfight the Germans, they out-engineered them. The rusted skeletons of the Phoenix caisson still sit off the coast of Arromanches today, half submerged in the tides of the English Channel. They are no longer feats of cutting-edge technology, but crumbling monuments to a moment when humanity refused to accept the limitations of geography. The Mulberry harbors represent a fundamental shift in the philosophy of conflict. Before June 1944, war was a struggle over existing resources, cities, bridges, and ports. After Mulberry, war became a race of industrial imagination. The Allies didn't just fight for a doorway into Fortress Europe, they manufactured the door and carried it with them. It was the ultimate expression of the arsenal of democracy, the belief that any obstacle, no matter how physically imposing, could be overcome by a combination of scientific precision and industrial scale. Beyond the steel and concrete, there is a deeper human truth in the story of the impossible ports. It serves as a reminder of what is achievable when the boundaries between the civilian and the military, and between the scientist and the soldier, are dissolved for a singular purpose. The mulberries were built by dockworkers in London, towed by merchant sailors from the Americas, and anchored by engineers under fire. In the quiet of the Normandy coast today, it is difficult to imagine the violent mechanical birth of these artificial harbors. Yet, every modern logistical triumph, from the rapid deployment of disaster relief to the massive offshore structures of the 21st century, traces its DNA back to the gray summer of 1944. The Americans and British proved that impossible is not a fact, but an engineering problem waiting for a solution. They didn't just win a battle, they redefined the reach of human capability.